I can have everyone's attention. Obviously, you can continue eating during the program, but we want to respect everyone's time to get started. First of all, welcome to everyone for coming to our next installment of Locks and Learn. Woo! Anyway, no laughing. All right, that's fine. Everyone's good. So anyway, welcome back to Locks and Learn. We have a great opportunity this morning with Rabbi Mordechai Becher. Before introducing Rabbi Becher to speak this morning, first of all, I want to thank our sponsors for this morning's program. To the Baumgarten family, Leila Nishmas, Steve's mother, Shenita Bas Benyamin, and to Jonathan Lastern family, Leila Nishmas, Jonathan's father, Tzvi Ben Dov, their grandfather. The Neshamos should have an aliyah. Thank you. And I also want to say thank you to both families for everything they do, and Jonathan and the Baumgarten family as well, everything they do for the shul, beyond sponsoring events. Really, it does not go unnoticed, and we appreciate all that you do for the shul as well. This program is in conjunction with Chazaq. I'm sure many of you have heard of Chazaq. And behind me, right? Chazaq. It's a major player in terms of Kiruv and in terms of Jewish education in many different venues in Queens and beyond. Many Torah events throughout the year are run through Chazaq, by Chazaq, and it is a great opportunity for us to be able to partner with Chazaq this morning and hopefully for future events as well. Before introducing Rabbi Becher, it is my great privilege to call upon Rabbi Akiva, who works with Chazaq, to introduce the organization and speak a little bit about it.
Thank you, Rabbi Danziger. I think he's a round of applause for the So to speak just for a quick moment just about the organization, and we're really looking forward that this will be the first of many programs and events that we do together. Amen. So just a quick word about the work of Chazaq. So just like the Rabbi mentioned, we help organize and coordinate different events, shiurim, and programs for men and women, and young and old, everyone for inspirational events to bring them closer to their Jewish heritage, to Torah. And we have a focus with a major focus with giving Jewish public school students Jewish education through after-school programs, through Sunday school programs in 15 different locations, and has a special division if parents who have children in public school, if they like to transfer to yeshiva, we help them in that process. And just the common denominator of Chazaq is the middle two letters of Chazaq are A and Z. And what does that mean? That we try to help the Jewish community in whatever way we could be, whether it's through inspiration, through public school outreach. So it's a great honor. Thank you so much, Rabbi Danziger, again, and really looking forward to many more programs together.
Rabbi Becher is really a man who ironically needs no introduction, but I'll give an introduction. You'll notice right away, hailing from Australia, Rabbi Becher is a senior lecturer for the Gateways organization. No. Not anymore.
No, that's an old bio.
This is an old, we got to call White Door and tell them. Yeah. Rabbi Becher teaches all over the world. I'm not using this anymore. That's it. Rabbi Becher teaches all over the world. He is renowned. He's even on TV. As we know, many of us see him on TV as well. He is a tremendous inspirational speaker with a breadth of knowledge on so many topics. It is really a tremendous privilege and merit for our shul to have Rabbi Becher hosting. I know various people from the community have told me in various interactions with Rabbi Becher. Some spent a little time with him in Egypt last year, and it's really a tremendous privilege for us to have him. So because I don't know if this is accurate what I have in front of me, I'm going to say it is my great privilege to call him Rabbi Becher to deliver words of Torah this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi, and it's a pleasure to be here. See you again after we met at YU, and happy birthday, Edith. And to those who are with me in Egypt, Sabah al Khair. That means good morning in Arabic, but doesn't matter. Okay, all right. So we are in the period in which the Talmud says, just as Av enters, Mama'atin b'simcha, we reduce our joy. The month of Av, we're not yet in the month of Av, but we tend to, especially Ashkenazim, we tend to increase the sadness to start from now. But it is true that we are in the 3 weeks between two of the fast days, which represent the great tragedies that occurred to the Jewish people, and amongst them exile. And the Talmud tells us that we should reduce in our happiness during this period of time. And it's interesting, and it says when Adar comes around, which is of course the month in which Purim falls, when we were saved from annihilation back in the days of the Persian Empire, the Talmud says just as we reduce our happiness in this period of time, we increase our happiness and our joy in the month of Adar. What's interesting here is that we can make a little bit of a deduction from the Talmud's language. A Talmud again says, in the month, just as in the month of Av we reduce our joy, in the month of Adar we increase our joy. What can we deduce from the language of the Talmud? That it's never turned off or on. It appears that you're always supposed to be in a state of happiness. It's just that sometimes you turn the volume down in this time, and sometimes you turn the volume up. But the implication is that the status quo, the default position of a Jew, should be what? Happiness, joyful. It's just we reduce it sometimes, increase it other times. And there are many good reasons for that. Happiness for many people is a lifesaver. If you can be in a positive state of mind, we know it can save a life. Famous story of one of my favorite Hasidic Rebbes, Reb Simcha Bunim of Pshischa. Do not ask me to spell it, for God's sake. But Reb Simcha Bunim of Pshischa was a 19th century Hasidic rabbi in Poland, and before he became a full-time Rebbe, he was the CFO of a lumber company in Danzig. Later on, he became a pharmacist, first licensed Jew who was a licensed Jewish pharmacist in Poland ever. He opened a pharmacy business in Pshischa, and then eventually became a full-time Hasidic Rebbe. But even when he was CFO of this lumber company, he had students, he had disciples. So he's walking along next to a river in Danzig with a number of his students. And it had been raining until then. There had been a lot of rain. The path was somewhat slippery and the river was quite swollen and running quite fast. One of the disciples slipped in the mud and fell into the river. None of them could swim. None of them could swim. Swimming was not a big thing amongst Hasidim in 19th century Poland. There was no, Bell's water polo team or Satmar synchronized swimming. That did not exist. So they didn't know what to do. They're running along. This guy's being swept away in the current, and he's pretty much given up. He's just letting him say, he figures it's over. This is the end. And then Reb Simcha Bunim yells at the guy in the river in Yiddish. He yells at him, "Give him grist zum Leviathan," which means, "Give my regards to the Leviathan." Now, this is not very helpful. You know what I mean? Someone's drowning, when they say in lifeguarding courses, throw them a line, they don't mean say, "G'day, regards to Nemo, mate," flip a noggin, the whole work. No, right? This doesn't make... but that's what happens. But what happens is, after the guy in the river hears this somewhat, inappropriate joke from Simcha Bunim, something changes in his face, and he starts to thrash around, and he actually is able to get himself close enough to shore that they can pull him out of the river. Amazing. And they saved his life. And the Hasidim asked Reb Simcha Bunim, they say, "It worked, but what were you thinking, Rabbi?" And Reb Simcha Bunim said, there's a verse in Isaiah that says, "Ki b'simcha teitzeyu," you shall go forth with joy. I understood it more literally. I understood it when you have simcha, joy, teitzeyu, you can get out of anything. When I saw the guy's face, it was full of despair. He'd given up hope, completely pessimistic. And I figured if I can inject a little bit of happiness somewhere, one neuron will yell to the other neuron over the synapse, "Dude, that was funny," then maybe that will change his demeanor. And it's worked. He changed from despair to hope, pessimism to optimism, and he saved himself. So according to Rav Simcha Bunim, happiness is a lifesaver. It's a lifesaver. Very famously, Rav Nachman of Breslov maintained that one should always be, he said, mitzvah gedola liyos b'simcha tamid, it's always a mitzvah to be happy. And he says depression is not a sin. He says, but it can lead to worse consequences than sins. And coming from Rav Nachman of Breslov, who talks about happiness all the time, sometimes you have a rabbi who is well fed, who is healthy, who's driving a nice car, lives in a nice house, and he tells you, be happy. So we sometimes say, yeah, easy for you to say. But Rav Nachman of Breslov he lost his wife and 2 children to a tuberculosis. He became sick with TB as well. His house was burnt down. He was attacked by Jews and non-Jews together. He had to leave his home and re-establish himself in another country, in another town known as Uman. And during that time, he was also the victim of lots of hostility towards him. And he himself contracted the disease and died at a fairly young age. So when he tells me, be happy, I type of listen a little more intently than some guy, right, whatever. But so that's the idea. So happiness is very important. And indeed, it's interesting to note that the Jewish people, one of our ancestors has the most unusual name, very unusual name. What's the name Yitzchak mean? Yitzchak means literally, Avram and Sarah call him Yitzchak. Why? Yitzchak means he will laugh. That's a little bit of a strange name to call your child. Calling a child, I don't know, what did Frank Zappa's child was? Frank Zappa, his kid was called Moon Unit. One of his children was Moon Unit Zappa. So, you call your son, and you don't want son to be called up Moon Unit Ben Frank, right? This is a little embarrassing. So calling your son, he will laugh, seems to be a little bit of a strange idea. There's something to it, and laughter is something which we find. Rabbi Akiva himself tells us in Ethics of the Fathers, Rabbi Akiva says that laughter and frivolity lead to sin. So Rabbi Akiva, the great sage, tells us that laughter and frivolity leads to sin. And yet, there are something like 5 or 6 times, at least, that Rabbi Akiva seems to laugh at inappropriate times. You may be familiar with some of them, but I'll tell you some of them. Number 1, he is walking along with some other rabbis, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yeshua. They're walking along. It's just after the destruction of the, maybe 50, 60 years after the destruction of the temple, the second temple. And he's walking along and they hear the sounds of music, celebration, screams and cries of joy from a Roman camp. The Romans had some pagan celebration, and these rabbis hear the Romans, the sound of celebration in the Roman army camp is like so loud they can hear it from I don't know how far away, a couple of kilometers. And all the sages start crying. Rabbi Akiva starts laughing. And they say to him, what are you doing? Why are you laughing? He says, why are you crying? He said, why are we crying? The temple of God lies in ruins. Jerusalem, his city, is destroyed. And here you've got these pagans, polytheists, rejoicing in their camp. We should not cry. Rabbi Akiva says, well, that's why I'm laughing. They say, how is that? And he said, I'm laughing because, he says, if this is the reward for those who transgress the will of God, think of the reward for those who fulfill his will. And they said to him, thank you, Nichamtanu, you have comforted us somewhat. The next story is by far the more famous. They're walking along, same group of rabbis, and they're walking obviously on a mountain overlooking the Temple Mount. And they see the ruins of the Holy of Holies, the ruins of the Second Temple, and they see jackals weaving their way around in the place where the Holy of Holies was. Shualim hilchu bo. Jackals walking in the temple. Jackals tend to hang out in places where there's no habitation, where there's no people. In other words, one of the signs of the abandonment of that place, one of the indications of the total destruction, that no one set foot there, there were no people there, was there jackals running around there. So, of course, the rabbis started crying. They started crying. And Rabbi Akiva starts laughing. And they said to him, why are you laughing? He said, why are you crying? They said, why are we crying? The place where the Torah says only one person, the high priest, after immersions in the mikveh and after preparation for a week beforehand, only can go in there once a year on the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, And that place is now so ruined, so destroyed, so abandoned, that there are jackals roaming around the ruins of the Holy of Holies. Why, you're asking us why we're crying? That's why we're crying. And Rabbi Akiva said, that's why I'm laughing. He said, I'm laughing because the prophecy of destruction is linked to the prophecy of redemption. And when I see the depths of destruction, I am witnessing also an indication of a redemption, an affirmation of that prophecy. And that's why I'm laughing. And their reply to him was, Akiva nichamtanu, Akiva, you have comforted us. But there's more. There's another place where they visit their great rabbi, Rabbi Lazar, who is suffering from a terrible sickness. And they walk in, Rabbi Lazar says to his students, feels very hot in here. And it was not hot, it was a winter day, it was cold. And the other students started crying at the suffering of their teacher. Rabbi Akiva wasn't laughing, but he was smiling. And his teacher said to him, why are you smiling? What are you smiling about? Look at, here's the Sefer Torah scroll, a living Torah scroll, burning up with fever, suffering, and you're smiling? Rabbi Akiva said, I looked at our teacher throughout his life. I saw that his vineyard was always full of grapes. His wine never turned to vinegar. His crops were always good. His family was... I saw that he had such tremendous success in this world, and I thought to myself, but that means if he's not being punished in this world for his sins, that means he's going to get it in the world to come. And I was worried. Now I see that he is being punished for his sins in this world. That means his world to come will be perfect. And then his teacher said to him, he said, Akiva, I've done wrong. What are my sins? And Akiva said, Rebbe, you yourself have taught us that there's a verse in Proverbs that says, Ki Adam ein tzadik ba'aretz, asher yaseh tov v'lo yechter. There is no human being alive in this world who does only good and has never missed the mark. He says that means it's impossible to say that you have not done any sin. And with that, his teacher said, Akiva, you've comforted me. Thank you. So that's three cases where Rabbi Akiva is laughing when everyone else is crying. There's another case. He's being brought to be executed by the Romans. Tyrannus Rufus, the Roman, is executing, or has ordered the execution of Rabbi Akiva. And when he sentences him to death, Rabbi Akiva laughs. And Tyrannus Rufus says, you're laughing? You think this is a joke? I've just sentenced you to death by torture. And Rabbi Akiva said, your sentence is temporary. You only rule a small amount of geographical location and only through a small amount of time. He says, I'm going to be going before the King of Kings, God, who rules all of space and all of time infinitely. He says, leaving your domain, going to the domain of God, I'm not scared. This reminds me, 2 weeks ago, there was we celebrated the release. People, the Hasidim especially, celebrated the release of one of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's from prison in Russia and the Soviet Union. And there's a story, I think two of them were actually imprisoned at different times, but the story is told, one of them is being interrogated by the NKVD, that was the predecessor of the KGB. And he's being interrogated, and he's asked by the KGB officer to reveal his network, because Chabad had a large network of underground Torah study in the Soviet Union. Other people also did. My wife and I taught there before Glasnost and Perestroika. And so he uncovered this network, and they wanted to know the names of the people. And the Rebbe would not give any names. And so the agent took out his gun, held it to the Rebbe's head, and he said, tell me now or I'll kill you. And the Rebbe laughed. Rebbe laughed at him. And he said, you think your toy is going to scare me? He says, you live in a temporary world. I'm going to an eternal world. He says, you worship temporary power. I worship he who is infinite. He says, doesn't scare me. the agent was so shocked by it, he put the gun away and he walked out of the room. He couldn't, he was, and it's interesting, the refuseniks, that's Jews in the Soviet Union. Some of you may remember the Soviet Union, right? That's when it was communist and evil. Now it's capitalist and righteous, of course, right? So, it was slightly sarcastic, I'm sorry. All right. But, so there was a song that the refuseniks would sing, which drove the Soviets crazy. And some of you may know the song, Nie bayusa nikavo krome boge odnavor, goes back na 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 ay ay ay. But anyway, the words are Nie bayusa nikavo krome boge odnavor. Right, and for the Russian speakers here is Venitya Yanigavari Paruski. So, but anyway, Niet Nikavo means we fear no one except for God, the only one. We fear no one. So you've got the might of the Soviet Union confronting a few hundred people in Moscow who are learning Torah in a clandestine fashion, and the SS-22 missiles and the Tupolev bombers and the Sukhoi fighter jets and the tanks and all that and the Kalashnikovs, etc. do not scare these people. They say, we're scared of only one thing, that's God the only one. They laughed in the face of the Soviet Union, and of course we know what happened, and eventually it collapsed. And these people, most of them, came to Israel and the United States. So, laughter, that's Rabbi Akiva, similarly laughed at Turnus Rufus. And one more case, Rabbi Akiva was being tortured to death by the Romans, and there's a smile on his face, and his students say, Rabbi, even now, already at this time they're used to his laugh, but they say, even now, at this point, this is already carrying it too far. And Rabbi Akiva says, every single day of my life, I have said the words, love the Lord your God, ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, you shall love the Lord your God, b'chol levavcha, with all your heart, b'chol nafshecha, with all your soul, b'chol modecha, with all your property. He says, I tried to fulfill with all my heart and with all my property, but he says, with my very life, I never had that opportunity. Now I have the opportunity to love the Lord my God, to love God, even with my very soul, and I should not be happy. So it's very interesting. Rabbi Akiva is laughing at times that every normal person, and you know, I say that with respect, every normal person would not be laughing, would be crying. So, and by the way, some say that's why Rabbi Akiva specifically is the one who says in Ethics of the Fathers that laughter and frivolity lead to sin. He doesn't want you to pick up from his behavior that you should take nothing seriously, that you should always be lightheaded and laughing at everything. So specifically, he needs to correct this, but at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what's behind Rabbi Akiva's laughter? What is behind it? As a side point, there is a book called The Or Zarua, Rav Yitzchak of Vienna, one of the medieval scholars, Vienna, 13th century, and in the introduction to his work, he says that he had a dream, and he was told there's lots of discussion about how to write certain names. It becomes halachically, legally very important to spell names correctly in legal documents, especially like a get, a divorce. Has to be done and there's a lot of discussion. How do you write names, and how do you write? So how do you spell Rabbi Akiva? So the Or Zarua, Rabbi Yitzchak of Vienna said, you spell it Ayin Kuf Yud Veit Hey, Akiva. Now, some of you will know that if you look in the Talmud, his name is spelt with an aleph at the end, which is actually the Or Zarua, that's an Aramaic version. But in Hebrew, it would be Ayin Kuf Yud Veit Hey. And the Or Zarua says, you know, it's hinted at in a verse. I was shown this in a dream. The verse is, or, ends with a resh, or Zarua Lat Tzadik Uli Yishrei Leiv Simcha, which means light will be invested, sown for the righteous, and for the straight of heart there will be happiness. That sentence, the last letter of each word, spells Rabbi Akiva. Light will shine for the righteous, or Zarua Lat Tzadik Uli Yishrei Leiv Simcha, but with a hey. So, interestingly, he saw in Rabbi Akiva's name spelled out in a verse that talks about the righteous laughing. So laughter is something that we don't really associate so much with the righteous, especially if you went to a Litvish yeshiva. We generally, right? Correct? Yeah, okay. Anyway, so, but we usually don't associate that with like laughter. He's always laughing. What's going on? And laughter is, I should point out, not a laughing matter. There is a lot of study that has been found in history. Philosophers, psychologists, religious thinkers, theologians have discussed the idea of laughter. And there are a number of different theories about it. Aristotle, and later on Thomas Hobbes, felt that it was a way to express your superiority over someone, that you've escaped the trap that they've fallen into. So it's an expression of joy at your superiority. That's how Aristotle put it. So that's why, you ask someone, as Groucho Marx gave the illustration, one of the great theologians and experts on humour. Groucho Marx put it this way. He says, you see a guy in an expensive, like $2,000 suit, beautiful watch, walking along dignified fashion in the street, and he slips on a banana peel and lands flat on his back. People laugh at that. That's funny. Groucho Marx says, that's funny. So I'll tell you what hilarious is. The same guy walking in the street steps over the banana peel into an open sewer. Now, some of you laughed at that. Now, why is that funny? So Aristotle would say the reason that is funny, and it's even funnier, is because I saw the open sewer, I saw the banana peel, I knew it was that. In other words, I am, so to speak, in a superior position, and I get joy from that. That's one theory. Sigmund Freud felt that laughter was usually what he calls masked aggression. It's a way of being aggressive towards someone, the butt of the joke, without being obvious about it. Masked aggression, right? There are sometimes this aggression against a group. There was a joke analysed in the European Journal of Psychology, one of the great sources of happiness in the world, and of a barber. A priest comes into the barber shop to get a haircut. Well, not during the 3 weeks, obviously. Right, gets to the barber shop to get a haircut, and after the cut, he says, how much will that be? The barber says, Father, you're a man of God. I'm not going to charge you. I just appreciate your coming to this place. And he gives him a blessing. Bless you, my son, etc. And he leaves. The next morning, the barber comes to the store. There's an envelope in the mail slot. It's from Father Mulcahy, and in it there's a crisp $10 bill. That's great. Not what I usually charge $35 plus a $5 tip, but it's nice of him. That was great. Yeah. Anyway, a couple of days later, an imam walks in, and the imam comes in. He gives him a haircut, and afterwards he says, "How much do I owe you?" And the barber says, "You're a man of God, Allah." He says, and no charge for you. And the imam gives him a blessing, right, etc. And he gives him the blessing and he says, "Thank you very much," and he leaves. And next morning there's an envelope from Imam, right, Suleiman and Mustafa, and it's a $10 bill in there. Fantastic. A few days later, next week, after Tisha B'Av, a rabbi comes in. And he gives the rabbi a haircut. He says, "No razor." He says, "Great." And he says, "How much is that?" And he says, "Rabbi, you're a man of God. I'm not going to charge you." So the rabbi says, "Thanks very much," and he leaves. The next morning, the barber comes to the door of his barber shop, and there's 10 rabbis waiting outside for a haircut. So this is what we call a case, as Freud would say, of masked aggression against a particular group, i.e. Jews, right? And obviously a stereotype, a negative stereotype, but there's a little bit of aggression there. It's masked by the humour. Churchill was an expert at this. Famously, he hated most other politicians. He had a special hatred for Lady Astor and a special hatred for Clement Attlee. In fact, Clement Attlee was absent in Parliament one day, and someone asked, "Where is Clement Attlee?" And Churchill said, "He's out on a speaking tour stirring up apathy." So I don't know if that's masked aggression. I think that's pretty open, right? But in any case, someone actually said, "Yes, but you must admit that Attlee is very humble." Churchill said he has much about which to be humble. So now there's a psychologist by the name of Fry who says that laughter is when there's communication paradoxes. So a communication paradox, words, etc. Just for example, this woman tells her husband's a computer programmer, logician computer program, and she says, honey, could you go and get bread? Oh, if they've got eggs, get me a dozen. So he comes back home with a dozen loaves of bread. She says, what the heck? He says, they had eggs. So anyway, the idea here is that, if I have to explain it, a joke is, one of my sons said, a joke is like a frog. If you dissect it, it dies. And now, we know that in terms of communication paradoxes, Yogi Berra, the great baseball coach, etc., was famous for this, right, as when he came to a stadium and he said, no wonder no one comes here anymore, it's so crowded, right? But the idea is, Jerry Seinfeld had an interesting insight as to why so many Jews are in comedy. And his insight was, because Jews, he says, are the eternal outsider. We are a nation, as we learnt in the parsha 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, double parsha was not Israel. Okay, fine. Right, so we are Am Levadad Yishkon, we are a nation that dwells alone. So Seinfeld pointed out, he says, Jews are type, like when you're an outsider, you can see the paradoxes, you can see the contradictions, you can see all that as an outsider. That's why Jews are always into it. Now, but the answer, I think, which is the most correct answer, is the Schopenhauer, great German philosopher, and this is also alluded to in one of the great Jewish philosophers, Yosef Albo, in Sefer Ikrim. Schopenhauer points out, he says, really, humor is about when your mind detects absurdity. What we laugh at is the absurd, something which it's absurd, right? There's a lot of that. If anyone lived in Israel, right? Anyone served in the IDF. I served in the IDF. I have 3 sons who are in the IDF, right? It's an amazing army, but it's a source of great absurdity, just the bureaucracy, etc. One of my sons had these combat goggles. He goes to the Afsanaut. Afsanaut is the storeroom, and he says, and his goggles were scratched. He was the sharpshooter of the unit. His goggles were scratched. So he says, listen, can I get, if Shalah Khlif, can I switch my goggles? And the guy in the booth, right, a overweight miluimnik, chain smoking, etc., around ammunition, right, and my son says, can you switch the goggles? And the guy says, lo shvurim, lo machlifim. They're not broken, we don't change them. So my son says, listen, I need to see clearly through the, right, this is the goggles, I'm shooting, he says, lo baya sheli, not my problem. They're not broken, we don't exchange them. So my son says, okay. He'd been in Israel long enough. He goes around the corner, takes off his goggles, stomps on them, his boot, picks up the pieces, comes back and he says, Achshav, now? And the guy says, Beseder. So absurdity plays a large role. You may know the story. I don't know if it's a true story. I think it might be true. But there was in Tzfat, the city of Tzfat, 1948, there were fortified positions in Tzfat. When the British left Israel, they left all their fortified positions to the Arabs. As my Rebbe, Rabbi Mordechai Shapiro, once said, he asked us in English, he was a Hebrew speaker, alav shalom, he said, you know why the sun never set on the British Empire? We said, no. He says, because Hashem does not trust them in the dark. But in any case, they left the fortified positions to the Arabs, and there are about a few hundred fighters of the Haganah in Tzfat, and there were a few thousand Jews living in Tzfat, and a reporter asked the commander of the Haganah unit in Tzfat, which actually became IDF unit, but whatever, right? It was on the cusp of that, and he asked him, "Do you think you'll win the battle for Tzfat, the city of Safed, north of Israel?" And the Israeli commander says, "Betach, of course." And he says, "How?" And the commander says, "Either miraculously or naturally, but either way we'll win." And the reporter says, "What would be a natural victory?" He says, "A natural victory would be if God would send fiery angels with swords in their hands down to this battlefield, scare the wits out of the Arabs, and they'd run away and we'd take Tzfat." So the reporter says, "That's natural?" He says, "Yes, that would be natural." He says, if that's natural, what's miraculous? He says, miraculous would be if my 300 teenagers would defeat 5,000 Arab fighters in fortified positions. That would be miraculous. As you know, both happened in Sfat. I won't go into the details, but both true. So actually, it's the absurdity, which is, according to Schopenhauer and others, it's the absurdity, right? And sometimes the funniest jokes are the ones which are most absurd, right? And I mean, kids love these little jokes. I ask my usually when I meet like my grandchildren, so my grandchildren already know all my jokes, but meet a little kid and I say, "How old are you?" And they say 6. I say, "Oh, when I was your age, I was also 6." And they look at me and they laugh. Okay, but it's an absurd statement. It's like logical tautology, etc. But in any case, but it is that absurdity, and something about that absurdity makes us laugh. And it's interesting, when Avraham and Sarah both got the news that they would, I mean, here is, they're both, he's 100, she's 90, right? They're living in a corner of the planet, small place called Israel, right? And Hashem tells them, he says, you will change the world. B, you'll have a son who will continue your legacy and will be a world history-changing person, and all this will happen sometime this year, next year. So now, most of us would say, you're kidding, right? It actually happened. And they called their son Yitzchak, which is a reference to that absurdity, right? He is a product of the absurd. And not only that, continues, because actually, after Yitzhak is born, before he is married, before he has descendants, before he is able to be actually a world history changer, what does Hashem tell Avraham to do? Take him and kill him. And in fact, the Talmud says that Yitzchak is, there's an interesting, it says that his ashes are actually on, he actually came to the point of death and went beyond that. In fact, his name, Yitzchak, Kabbalists tell us, if rearranging the letters, spells the Kates Chai. Kates Chai means what? Kates? The end of life. He went beyond the end of life and continued living. And it makes sense that the Jewish people are called after Yitzchak as well. Because we have, so many times throughout history, gone to the end of life and continued onwards. There is a certain absurdity to the Jewish people. You may have heard of Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee was a historian. He wrote an 8-volume work of world history. And he had a debate with, I think it's Yaakov Herzog, I guess would be the uncle of the current president of the state of Israel. He was the son of the chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Yitzhak Isaac Herzog, great genius and Talmud Torah scholar. And so Yaakov Herzog debated Arnold Toynbee. This is sometime in the late 1940s, right? And Toynbee refers to the Jews as a fossil people. You are fossilized. He says, at this point in history, what would make sense would be for the Jews just to give up. Because anyway, you're fossils. Fossils don't have the right to a state. Fossils don't have the right to independence. Fossils don't have the right to self-determination. They're fossils, right? That's it. You're gone, right? He says you'll join all those other nations beforehand. The Etruscans and the Hittites and the Assyrians and Babylon and all those, they're all fossils as well. You'll be a fossil. We'll have you in the museum. So it's interesting. I took a group of Israelis on a tour of the Met, the museum in New York. Not the Met. Yeah, it was the Met in New York. And we're walking around showing them artifacts. And they say to me, "Where are the Jewish artifacts?" I said, "There are no Jewish artifacts here. We're using them still." You know what I mean? There's Etruscan artifacts. It's not like, fine, this is what a Jew looked like. It was like, right? There are those who wanted to create such a museum, as we well know, right? But, and that is hinted at in the name Yitzchak as well. It's the absurdity of the Jewish people's existence. It's incredible. So after this debate with Toynbee and Herzog, which I think, well, most of us would say Herzog won, but either way, Abba Eban, who was the great diplomat, one of the most eloquent speakers the State of Israel has ever had. So Abba Eban gave a speech at Yeshiva University, where I teach and where your rabbi graduated from. And so he gave a speech at Yeshiva University, and he said, one of his lines, just a great line, he said, "The fossil, not having read the 8 volumes of Toynbee's history, is unaware of its own petrification and continues to behave as if it's a living being." And indeed, that's true. I don't know of any Jews, I do know some who've read the 8 volumes, right? They're professors at Revel. Okay, fine, right? But nevertheless, that's right. We're not aware of our own petrification. We continue as though we are alive and kicking, and indeed we are. And by the way, that I think is one of the explanations for the hostility towards the State of Israel, and the hostility, the insane hostility. I mean, when you think about it, the people who are opposed to the State of Israel are the most strange partners ever. Southern Baptists, pro-BDS, Muslims, not exactly a group that you put in the same, right? Southern Baptists and Muslims, right? No, right? And the extreme right, and the extreme left. And as Woody Allen put it, when his parents sent him to interfaith camp in summer. He says, "There I was beaten equally by people of all races and creeds." So, but it's strange that these weird people, they're bedfellows, the left, the right, communists, capitalists, Christians, right, Muslims, etc. Why? What is it? I think one answer is that the miraculous nature of the Jewish people's existence, the miraculous nature of our return to our ancient land, the miraculous nature of our success in militarily, economically, scientifically, in the land of Israel, the idea that we have revived a language that was only used for prayer for thousands of years, and now that language has scientific papers and journals written in it, stock market mergers and acquisitions are conducted in Hebrew, etc., etc. I mean, that's miraculous. Now, for us, for Jews, we look at that and we hear the footsteps of the Messiah approaching. But if you believe the Messiah has already come, if you believe that the Jewish people are no longer chosen, but they're frozen, if you don't believe in any type of supernatural redemption, etc., if you believe the Jews, right, are gone and fossilized, when you hear these footsteps, what you hear is something frightening. You hear the destruction of your own belief system. You hear the destruction of your theology. You hear the destruction of your belief or non-belief, etc. And that is indeed what people hear. Right? There's a fear because, in terms of Christianity, Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, many of the great doctors, theologians of the Catholic Church, they all said, all of them, they said that the Jews, because they rejected Jesus, will be downtrodden, humiliated, and oppressed for all eternity. They will never get the land of Israel back because they have not, until they accept Jesus. Now, what happened in 1948? We didn't accept Jesus, and yet we got the land of Israel back. And that coincided. What happened was the Vatican, in one of the volumes of their theological output, I think it was called Moralis, maybe it was volume 5 or something, I don't remember, but they actually changed that prediction. They said, no, the Jews won't get Jerusalem back until... So they theologically were safe and sound until 1967. And from that time on, the Vatican started calling for internationalizing Jerusalem because they're concerned of the holy places. Really? When the Jordanians were destroying churches, making urinals out of Jewish gravestone, the Vatican didn't say a word. Why? Because that situation was not a threat to their beliefs. When the Jews come back to Jerusalem, renovate the churches, put up signs in Hebrew, Arabic and English, right? Clear up the Via Dolorosa, right? Let Muslims build mosques, etc. Now the Vatican's concerned for the holy sites. Really? The Vatican's concerned for their own skin because we are a contradiction to their belief. And for Muslims who look at the Quran, at Surah 9 and other surahs, chapters of the Quran, which says humiliation and wretchedness will fall upon them because they rejected Allah and they killed the prophets wrongly, that type of statement, they look at the Jews and they see Jews who are not humiliated or wretched. So what's going on? They rejected Allah, but yet they're here. They have a beautiful country. They have their own. Right? No, that's the problem. And it says that humiliation, they will only be redeemed if they reach out and pay tribute. That's what the source of Sharia law, the idea of jizya, that Jews, dhimma, the people protected minorities like Jews and Christians have to pay to the Muslim overlords as we had to do for 1,000 years or so in the various countries in the Middle East. But that doesn't work if Israel's an independent country, if the Jews are independent. What's going on? So what they're seeing, what we see and hear the footsteps of the Messiah, they hear the footsteps of their own destruction of their ideology. And if you are an extreme leftist and you're atheist and you believe there's nothing special about the Jews, how can that be? They're just people, right? They don't even have the intersectionality that other minorities have, which we actually do. But okay, we're adjacent white, whatever the heck you want to say, right? But either so, right, if you come from that perspective, then there's also a problem. Jews present a problem as well. Because have we suffered? Yeah. Were we discriminated against? Yes. How are we doing? Pretty well, considering. Not even considering, pretty well. So that's a problem. We are a contradiction to those beliefs. And if you're at the right wing and you say the Jews are evil and so on and so forth, the state of Israel is a problem. The state of Israel is a problem for them. And so therefore, there is, in the words of the Ritva, Rabbi Yontef Ben Alashvili, Rabbi Yontef from Seville in Spain, one of the early medieval scholars, the Ritva, he uses a phrase, nes l'ra'ah. He's describing that in the temple, the Holy of Holies, even in the midst of destruction, the Romans, it says that the cherubs, which were made of gold, when the Romans ripped open the parochet, the curtain of the Holy of Holies, they saw the cherubs, which are golden sculptures on top of the ark, embracing each other. And it was like, first of all, that's miraculous, right? They're gold, they can't move, right? That's miraculous. They're embracing each other, and he says what we call a negative miracle. Not all miracles leave you with a good, warm, cushy feeling, right? Sometimes here's a miracle that happened, but it was a miracle for bad. But one thing which is interesting, and this is Reb Chaim Volozhiner discusses, he says, but this is in the midst of destruction. In the midst of this destruction, how could it be that these people, sorry, I have to stop and have 5 minutes? 5 minutes, I'll stop in 5 minutes. These people, where do you have, in the midst of this destruction, you've got a miracle happening. And Reb Chaim Volozhin says, because even in the midst of that destruction, even in the worst possible situations, God is with the Jewish people. You only have to wait a little bit and you'll see. There's an absurdity. Here is in the midst of destruction, the destruction of the temple, the worst, etc. And yet, what happens is something absurd. There's something which expresses the love between God and the Jewish people. Right? Reminding of the beautiful statement of Reb Nachman of Bretzov, which was turned into a song by Reb Yosef Karduna, right? Afilu b'hastara, shebetocha hastara, even in the hiddenness, the concealment within the concealment, Hashem is nevertheless there. And that is something which is the absurdity of Jewish history. Why is it that we laugh? Our soul, when the soul experiences something of the future world, because the future world will look back on all the suffering of exile, will look back of all of the oppression and everything, we'll be able to look back and see how it all brought us to a point of redemption. It brought all the world and the Jewish people to this point where we say, Az Yimale Sechok Pinu. Then all of our mouths will be full of laughter. It won't be just a chuckle. It will be total laughter, right? And that laughter will be looking back, and because really the world is, in some sense, there's lots of absurdity that happens. It's hard to laugh always because that absurdity is hurting us and hurting people we know, we love, etc., or hurting people we don't even know love, but humans nonetheless. So that absurdity, but when we detect something which is obviously absurd in this world, the soul feels a little bit of a contact with the future. a little bit of a... And that's why Yitzchak was not called tzchok, past laughter. He was not called tzachak, he laughed, but he was called Yitzchak. Little Hebrew grammar, not too early Sunday morning, you've had coffee. Yitzchak is future tense. He will laugh. And that is... So when it comes to the 3 weeks, even though we do tend, and we have to reduce our joy, we don't have marriages during this time, we don't groom ourselves normally during this time, we don't say Shechianu, for example, but we are mourning. But at the end of the day, we don't turn off the happiness. It's just a little bit suppressed. It's a lower volume. And it's interesting that when we get to Tisha B'Av, which we hope this year will be a Yom Tov, there are components on Tisha B'Av which are indicative of that future state, the latent Yom Tov. Right? Men do not put on tefillin in the morning, just like on a Shabbos and a Yom Tov. Right? We also don't say Tahanun, which is the prayer we say on regular days. Right? And there is, it's also, even in Jeremiah calls it Kara Alai Moed. It's called a Moed. Moed is a term usually reserved for a festival. And the reason for that is because it will turn into a festival, it will turn into a Yom Tov. And with that, I want to say that when, as Jews, to take the lesson from Rabbi Simcha Bunim and take the lesson from Rabbi Akiva, which is, yes, we take life seriously, but when we look at the opposition to us, we should see that, we should look at that and laugh. When we look at that hatred, we should look at that and laugh, because we know that that is only because the footsteps of the Messiah are approaching. These people are reacting with fear. These people are reacting with trepidation. And the fossil, that's us. We are not aware of our own petrification, in the words of Abba Iban, and we will indeed come back to life, as the other great song, Shlomo Carlebach, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish nation lives. And that is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, is with us, afilu b'hastara, even in the darkness, b'toch hastara, hidden by the darkness, even within that, Hashem is with us and will bring us back to Israel, to Yerushalayim, and to the Beis HaMikdash speedily in our days. Meher v'yameinu, amen.
Again, we want to thank Rabbi Becher again for words of Torah this morning. Rabbi Becher has hundreds, if not thousands, of shiurim on YU Torah, on Torah Anytime, and throughout the internet. Check it out. There's so much there, a wealth of information. So again, we want to thank Rabbi Becher. We want to thank Chazaq, and again, we want to thank our sponsors this morning. That the Shir Reuel Nishma Sheni Itabas Binyamin and Steve Ben Dov, the Neshama Shadav and Aliyah. Thank you to everyone for coming. And again, we'll be starting this testing immediately after the lockdown. We're going to bench now. And again, thank you to everyone for coming.